Hello, welcome to OJ Studios. Please enjoy today's chapter of Ghost by Olivia Julius.
I spent the rest of the night in Elizabeth's small body, sitting in her room, thinking. Her young frame grew restless as the hours passed, but I eventually gave in to the routine I had to maintain and climbed into her bed. The pink nightgown was soft, clinging to her body in a way that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. Still, I pulled the blankets up and closed her eyes, willing myself into something that resembled sleep. Morning came quickly. I felt a hand gently shake Elizabeth's shoulder, pulling me from a fog of scattered thoughts. "Miss Elizabeth, it's time to get up," came the soft, polite voice of one of the maids. I blinked through Elizabeth's eyes, pretending to yawn as I sat up, her small hands rubbing at her face. The maid stood by the bed, her neatly pressed uniform impeccable, holding a tray with a glass of orange juice and a light breakfast. "Your father wanted me to remind you to be ready by mid-morning," she said with a kind smile, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Some of Mr. Yates's associates will be arriving, and he'd like you to be present for a short while before your lessons." "Thank you," I replied softly, Elizabeth's voice high and sweet. The maid nodded and left, and I sighed, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. "This works perfectly," I thought, picking up the glass of orange juice and taking a sip. If Alan's assistants were coming here, it was the perfect opportunity. I could possess one of them, preferably the male assistant I'd used before, and finally dig deeper into Operation Sawyer. It was the only real lead I had, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. I forced Elizabeth through her morning routine, allowing the maids to help her pick out a dress, a simple yellow sundress with white sandals. It felt strange wearing something so delicate and childlike, but I went along with it, keeping up the act. By mid-morning, I was in the sitting room, seated on a plush chair near the large bay windows. Elizabeth's memories guided me as I folded her hands in her lap and glanced out at the gardens, her posture proper and poised. The sound of car doors closing in the driveway snapped my attention to the front of the house. Through the window, I saw two sleek black cars pull up. Out stepped Alan, his polished suit immaculate as always, followed closely by two of his assistants, the male and female pair from last night's meeting. "Perfect!" I stayed still, pretending to be lost in thought as the group entered the house. Alan spotted me immediately, giving a small nod in acknowledgement. "Good morning, Elizabeth," he said smoothly as he walked past. "Good morning, Daddy," I replied with Elizabeth's voice, giving him a polite smile. The assistants followed him toward the study, and I waited until they disappeared down the hallway before standing. I moved carefully, glancing around to ensure no one was watching, then followed them at a distance. When they entered the study and closed the door, I waited in the hallway, listening. After a moment, I unpossessed Elizabeth and became in my ghostly form again.
I leaned into the door, slipping through its solid surface and into the room in my ghostly form. Inside, Alan was already seated at his desk, speaking with the assistants about the campaign. I hovered near the male assistant, waiting for the right moment. When Alan turned to pull a document from a drawer, I seized the opportunity.
I leaned into the assistant, feeling the familiar tug as I slipped into her body. Her mind resisted slightly, but it didn't take long before I had full control. She blinked, confused for a moment, but I steadied her movements, sitting her down in the chair and focusing on the task at hand. This was my chance. As the meeting continued, I stayed silent, watching and waiting for the right moment to steer the conversation back to Operation Sawyer. It was time to find out the truth. The meeting ended before I had the chance to steer the conversation toward Operation Sawyer. Alan dismissed his assistants with his usual commanding tone, gesturing for them to get started on the tasks he had outlined. I stood, or rather, the assistant's body stood, offering a polite nod before turning to leave the study. The frustration was already building. This had been my chance, and it had slipped through my fingers. But as I walked back toward the main hall, I reminded myself that I still had one option left. If I can't get him to talk about it, I'll dig into his mind instead. I guided the assistant's body to an empty room and closed the door behind me, ensuring we were alone. Taking a deep breath, though it wasn't necessary, I focused inward, turning my attention to her thoughts and memories. I'd done this before with others, easily sifting through their minds to uncover pieces of their lives. But as I reached for the assistant's memories, something strange happened. There was resistance. It wasn't like the faint hesitation I'd felt when possessing him earlier. This was sharp, deliberate, and unmistakable, like slamming into a wall. The closer I got to thoughts related to Operation Sawyer, the stronger the resistance became, as though something was actively blocking me. "What the hell?" I muttered aloud, his voice low and gruff. I pushed harder, trying to break through the barrier, but it was no use. It wasn't just resistance, it was a complete mental block, designed to keep those memories locked away. The frustration burned hotter now. First Alan, and now this assistant. Both of them had information about Operation Sawyer, but someone, had taken steps to ensure it couldn't be accessed. It wasn't natural. Whatever was protecting these memories, it wasn't just strong, it was deliberate, intentional, and precise. I leaned back in the assistant's chair, clenching her fists tightly. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was something deeper, something more calculated. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that the truth about Operation Sawyer and my murder stayed hidden. But why? And more importantly, how did they know to protect it from someone like me? I sat in silence for a moment, weighing my options. It was clear now that simply possessing people and digging into their minds wasn't going to work, not with Alan, and not with anyone directly tied to him. I'd have to find another way in. For now, I decided to leave the assistant's body. I couldn't risk him noticing something was off or drawing too much attention. Leaning back, I concentrated and pulled myself out, slipping into my ghostly form once more. The assistant blinked, disoriented for a moment, before shaking his head and muttering something under his breath. He straightened his tie and left the room, completely unaware of what had just happened.
I hovered in the empty space, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Whoever was behind this, they knew exactly what they were doing. But I wasn't giving up. I'll find a way to break through, I thought, my resolve hardening. No matter what it takes. I floated silently through the halls of the estate, frustration simmering as I replayed the failed attempt to uncover Operation Sawyer. Something, or someone, had gone to extraordinary lengths to block that information, and it only fueled my determination to dig deeper. As I passed the grand staircase, raised voices drew my attention. In one of the sitting rooms just off the foyer, Alan stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. Opposite him was William, his posture tense and defensive, though his bloodshot eyes betrayed his current state. "I give you everything, William." Alan's voice was sharp and cutting. "And this is how you repay me." "The maid found more of this garbage in your room." William's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening. "I told you I was done with it," he snapped, his voice hoarse but defiant. "I don't know how that got there." "Don't lie to me," Alan growled, stepping closer. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't know exactly what you're doing when you disappear for hours at a time?" William's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders hunching slightly. For a moment, he looked like a scolded child, but there was an undercurrent of anger in his stance, a spark that could ignite at any moment. The tension between them was palpable, and I hovered nearby, watching the exchange with a growing sense of unease. Alan finally let out a frustrated sigh, shaking his head. "I've had enough of this, William. If you can't control yourself, I'll do it for you. Don't make me take more drastic measures. William's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. What the hell does that mean? Alan didn't answer. Instead, he turned sharply on his heel and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. William stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his hands still clenched into fists. This was my chance. If William had access to the family's database, or even just a shred of insight into what Alan was hiding, I needed to find out. I floated closer, leaning into him carefully.
Unlike Alan or his assistant, there was no resistance this time. William's mind was open, his defenses worn down by exhaustion, anger, and whatever drugs lingered in his system. In an instant I was in. William's body felt heavier than Elizabeth's, his movements sluggish and unsteady. His bloodshot eyes stung slightly as I blinked, and his heart raced in his chest, a steady thrum that matched the tension in his muscles. I took a deep breath, or at least mimicked one, and steadied his posture, forcing his fists to unclench. Let's see what you know. I glanced around the room, making sure no one was watching, then turned and headed toward the nearest study. William's memories guided me, faint, hazy impressions of where he'd seen his father work late into the night. I found a desk with a computer on it, the sleek screen dark and waiting. Sitting down, I woke it up, the glow illuminating the dim room. Navigating the computer with William's body felt awkward. His hands were shaky, his thoughts scattered, but I focused, searching for any way to access the family's server. But when I reached for anything tied to Operation Sawyer, I hit the same wall. That same unnatural barrier blocked me, sharper this time, as if it recognized me. Damn it, I thought, leaning back in William's chair. His body ached from tension, his head pounding faintly as I processed the failure. It was clear now that whoever had created this system had anticipated something, like me. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a fortress, and I had no idea how to breach it. I clenched William's fists, frustration boiling over. If I couldn't get into the database, I'd have to look elsewhere. Alan, I thought bitterly. It always comes back to him. I forced myself to relax, steadying William's breathing as I considered my next move. For now, I'd stay in William's body. If nothing else, he was close enough to Alan to observe him without raising suspicion. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find a crack in the armor. As I sat in William's body, staring at the impenetrable wall that blocked access to the family's database, I let out a frustrated sigh. This isn't working. The answers I needed weren't going to come easily, not through the server, at least. I glanced around the room, my borrowed eyes landing on a sleek, personal laptop sitting haphazardly on a small table in the corner. Unlike the desktop computer, this one wasn't tied to the Yates family's official system. It was just William's personal machine. It's worth a shot. I walked over, William's movements sluggish and uneven, and sat down in front of the laptop. The screen was dark, but when I pressed the power button, it flickered to life. Thankfully, William's computer didn't have a password set, and I was in within moments. The interface was messy, a cluttered desktop with random folders, gaming apps, and half-finished essays from a school he'd long since stopped caring about. But I wasn't interested in his hobbies or failed assignments. I opened his browser, navigating to his search history, and that's when I found it. My name. It was right there, listed among his recent searches from last night. I froze, staring at the screen, my thoughts racing. William had searched my name. Not Alan's campaign, not his father's projects, but he searched for me. I clicked on the entry, and the search results loaded. Most of them were familiar, the same obituary and news article I'd seen on Elizabeth's computer. But one link caught my attention, one I hadn't seen before. It was a discussion thread on an obscure forum. The title read, "Cover Up in the City, Random Mugging, or Something More?" I clicked it, and the thread opened, revealing a series of posts from anonymous users speculating about my death. And others in the city. Most of the posts were nonsense, conspiracy theories and baseless claims, but one stood out. It was from a user named Shadowleak, and it read, Sawyer's death wasn't random. There's no way the police haven't figured that out by now. Someone's pulling strings to bury this. Yates has connections everywhere. Don't think for a second this is just about a mugging. There's more to this, and if you dig deep enough, you'll find it. My hands tightened around the laptop, William's knuckles turning white. He knows something, I thought. Or at least, he suspected enough to dig into it. But the question was, why? Why was William looking into my death? Did he know something his father wasn't telling him, or was he just curious? My mind raced as I pieced it together. If William had searched my name, it meant he wasn't entirely in the dark. He might not have known the full story, but he knew enough to start asking questions. I leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen as my thoughts spiraled. This was a clue, a crack in the carefully constructed facade Alan had built around my murder. And if William was asking questions, it meant he might be more involved, or more useful, than I'd originally thought. For now, I'd stay in William's body. If he was digging into my death, I needed to know why. And more importantly, I needed to know what he planned to do next. After hours of struggling against the overwhelming cravings that came with William's drug-addicted body, I realized I couldn't hold on much longer. The pull was relentless, like an itch that demanded to be scratched, and it was distracting me from what really mattered, finding answers. Frustrated and exhausted, I leaned back in William's chair and made the decision to let go.
The familiar pull of separation washed over me as I slipped out of his body. William slumped forward slightly, rubbing his temples as though shaking off a fog, completely unaware of what had just happened. I floated silently, retreating from the room and into the mansion's sprawling halls. I needed a new plan. As I wandered, scanning for opportunities, the distant sound of car tires crunching on gravel caught my attention. I floated to one of the large windows overlooking the driveway just as a sleek black limo pulled up. The door opened, and my attention snapped to the figure stepping out. It was a woman, poised and elegant, her movements deliberate as she adjusted her coat and waved the driver off. Her face was immediately recognizable, even from a distance: Hannah Yates, Alan's estranged wife, and William and Elizabeth's mother. A flood of Elizabeth's memories filled my mind. Hannah was rarely present, her relationship with Alan long since fractured. Her absence had left a mark on both children, though it was Elizabeth who clung to her mother's rare visits with a quiet desperation. Perfect, I thought, floating closer. Hannah was my way in. If anyone could speak casually with Alan and probe for information without raising suspicion, it was her. I didn't hesitate. As she walked toward the mansion's entrance, I leaned into her, letting the strange, weightless sensation of possession take over.
Hannah resisted slightly, more than Elizabeth or William had, but it wasn't enough to stop me. Within seconds I was in. Her body felt different, graceful and composed, her movements deliberate and practiced. She carried herself with an air of confidence that I hadn't felt in any of my previous hosts. I blinked through her eyes, taking in the familiar sight of the mansion's grand entrance as she reached for the door. Her fingers were long and slender, adorned with rings that sparkled in the sunlight. I steadied myself, focusing on her memories. They came quickly, flooding my mind with fragments of her life: tense arguments with Alan, bittersweet moments with her children, the loneliness of being sidelined in a world of power and politics. More importantly, I absorbed enough to understand how to navigate her interactions with Alan. She knew his habits, his triggers, and how to speak to him in a way that wouldn't immediately set him on edge. The door opened and I stepped inside, forcing a small smile as one of the maids greeted me. "Mrs. Yates," she said with a polite nod. "Mr. Yates is in his study. Shall I let him know you're here?" "That won't be necessary," I replied smoothly, Hannah's voice calm and composed. "I'll find him myself." The maid nodded and stepped aside, and I made my way down the familiar halls, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. As I approached the study, I felt a flicker of nervous energy, not mine but hers. Despite her outward composure, Hannah's relationship with Alan was strained, and her memories were filled with tension and unresolved conflict. I pushed the feelings aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. This was my chance to speak to Alan directly, to see if I could draw out anything about my murder, or Operation Sawyer, without him realizing it. I adjusted her coat, took a steadying breath, and stepped into the study. Alan looked up from his desk, his expression neutral as his sharp eyes landed on me. "Hannah," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I wasn't expecting you." I forced a casual smile, letting Hannah's confidence shine through. "I thought it was time we talked," I said smoothly, stepping further into the room. "There are a few things we need to address." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk, his expression unreadable. "By all means," he said, his tone even. I sat down, crossing her legs gracefully as I prepared to dive into the conversation. "Time to see what you're hiding, Alan." After hours of struggling against the overwhelming cravings that came with William's drug-addicted body, I realized I couldn't hold on much longer. The pull was relentless, like an itch that demanded to be scratched, and it was distracting me from what really mattered: finding answers. Frustrated and exhausted, I leaned back in William's chair and made the decision to let go. The familiar pull of separation washed over me as I slipped out of his body. William slumped forward slightly, rubbing his temples as though shaking off a fog, completely unaware of what had just happened. I floated silently, retreating from the room and into the mansion's sprawling halls. I needed a new plan. As I wandered, scanning for opportunities, the distant sound of car tires crunching on gravel caught my attention. I floated to one of the large windows overlooking the driveway just as a sleek black limo pulled up. The door opened and my attention snapped to the figure stepping out. It was a woman, poised and elegant, her movements deliberate as she adjusted her coat and waved the driver off. Her face was immediately recognizable even from a distance: Hannah Yates, Alan's estranged wife and William and Elizabeth's mother. A flood of Elizabeth's memories filled my mind. Hannah was rarely present, her relationship with Alan long since fractured. Her absence had left a mark on both children, though it was Elizabeth who clung to her mother's rare visits with a quiet desperation. Perfect, I thought, floating closer. Hannah was my way in. If anyone could speak casually with Alan and probe for information without raising suspicion, it was her. I didn't hesitate. As she walked toward the mansion's entrance, I leaned into her, letting the strange, weightless sensation of possession take over. Hannah resisted slightly, more than Elizabeth or William had, but it wasn't enough to stop me. Within seconds I was in. Her body felt different, graceful and composed, her movements deliberate and practiced. She carried herself with an air of confidence that I hadn't felt in any of my previous hosts. I blinked through her eyes, taking in the familiar sight of the mansion's grand entrance as she reached for the door. Her fingers were long and slender, adorned with rings that sparkled in the sunlight. I steadied myself, focusing on her memories. They came quickly, flooding my mind with fragments of her life: tense arguments with Alan, bittersweet moments with her children, the loneliness of being sidelined in a world of power and politics. More importantly, I absorbed enough to understand how to navigate her interactions with Alan. She knew his habits, his triggers, and how to speak to him in a way that wouldn't immediately set him on edge. The door opened and I stepped inside, forcing a small smile as one of the maids greeted me. "Mrs. Yates," she said with a polite nod. "Mr. Yates is in his study. Shall I let him know you're here?" "That won't be necessary," I replied smoothly, Hannah's voice calm and composed. "I'll find him myself." The maid nodded and stepped aside, and I made my way down the familiar halls, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. As I approached the study, I felt a flicker of nervous energy, not mine but hers. Despite her outward composure, Hannah's relationship with Alan was strained, and her memories were filled with tension and unresolved conflict. I pushed the feelings aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. This was my chance to speak to Alan directly, to see if I could draw out anything about my murder, or Operation Sawyer, without him realizing it. I adjusted her coat, took a steadying breath, and stepped into the study. Alan looked up from his desk, his expression neutral as his sharp eyes landed on me. "Hannah," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I wasn't expecting you." I forced a casual smile, letting Hannah's confidence shine through. "I thought it was time we talked," I said smoothly, stepping further into the room. "There are a few things we need to address." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk, his expression unreadable. "By all means," he said, his tone even. I sat down, crossing her legs gracefully as I prepared to dive into the conversation. "Time to see what you're hiding, Alan." As I guided Hannah's body up the wide, polished staircase, I felt her muscles tense. Her memories told me that visits to Elizabeth's room were rare, but they were always significant. Elizabeth adored her mother, and any time they spent together was precious to the young girl. I reached Elizabeth's door and knocked softly. "Come in." Elizabeth's sweet voice called from the other side. I opened the door to find her sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing with a small collection of dolls spread out in front of her. When she looked up and saw her mother, her face lit up with pure joy. "Mommy," she cried, jumping to her feet and running toward me. Before I could react, she threw her arms around Hannah's waist, hugging her tightly. The warmth and love radiating from the gesture made me pause, a flicker of guilt tugging at me. This wasn't my moment, it was hers. I hesitated for just a second, then made my decision. As Elizabeth held on to Hannah, I pulled myself out of her body, the familiar weightless sensation washing over me as I returned to my ghostly form.
Hannah blinked, momentarily disoriented, but quickly recovered. She wrapped her arms around Elizabeth, holding her close. "Elizabeth," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine affection. "It's so good to see you." I hovered nearby, watching the tender moment. It felt wrong to intrude, but I needed Elizabeth now. This was my best chance to stay close to Alan without drawing suspicion, and maybe even uncover more about what he was hiding. As the hug ended, I leaned toward Elizabeth, slipping into her small body with ease.
The transition was smooth, her mind open and trusting. I felt her warmth, her love for her mother still fresh in her thoughts. But I gently pushed those feelings aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. "Mommy," I said in Elizabeth's soft voice, smiling up at Hannah. Hannah crouched down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from Elizabeth's face. "How have you been, sweetheart?" "I've been okay," I replied, keeping her tone light and innocent. "I missed you." Hannah's expression softened, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "I missed you too, my little angel." She stayed with me for a few more minutes, chatting about small things, school, toys, and how much she loved Elizabeth's dress. I played along, channeling the happy, innocent demeanor Elizabeth was so good at. When Hannah finally left, giving Elizabeth's forehead a soft kiss before heading back downstairs, I sat on the edge of her bed, swinging her legs back and forth as I thought. I was back in Elizabeth's body, closer to Alan than ever. And this time, I wasn't going to let the opportunity slip through my fingers. I guided Elizabeth's small body out of her room, her white tights brushing against each other as I descended the wide, elegant staircase. The house was quiet, with the occasional murmur of staff echoing faintly through the halls. I was careful, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, trying to blend in and avoid suspicion. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, a door caught my attention. It was labeled security, the bold lettering almost daring me to step inside. My curiosity got the better of me. If the Yates family had a room dedicated to security, there was a chance it held something important, perhaps access to the family database, surveillance footage, or even details about Operation Sawyer. I turned Elizabeth's small hand on the doorknob and pushed it open. The room was sleek and futuristic, lined with monitors that displayed camera feeds from every corner of the estate. A large control panel sat at the center, blinking with various lights and touchscreens. Before I could take a step inside, alarms blared. A loud, mechanical voice echoed through the room. "Alert! Ghost detected in the security center!" I froze, my heart, or rather, Elizabeth's, hammering in her chest. Lockdown initiated. Security override required. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening clang, trapping me inside. I ran to the door, twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. How did they know? I tried to leave Elizabeth's body, to pull away from her and return to my ghostly form, but something was wrong. No matter how hard I focused, I couldn't escape, it was like I was tethered to her, bound in a way I hadn't been before. "I can't get out!" I stumbled back from the door, Elizabeth's breathing quick and shallow as I fought the rising panic. The robotic voice continued its warnings, the alarms blaring relentlessly. Ghost presence confirmed. Lockdown procedures active. I scanned the room, searching for a way to override the system, but the controls looked too complex, designed for someone far more experienced than an 11-year-old girl. What the hell is this? The Yates family had prepared for something like me. Ghost detection, security protocols, this wasn't just wealth and power. This was paranoia. And now, I was stuck. Stuck in Elizabeth's body. Stuck in a room designed to trap me. I clenched her small fists, her soft palms pressing into her sides as I forced myself to think. I couldn't afford to panic. Not now. There's always a way out. But as the alarms continued to blare, I couldn't shake the growing fear that this time, I might actually be trapped. The alarms blared relentlessly, the robotic voice echoing over and over, ghost presence confirmed. Lockdown procedures active. I was frantically scanning the room for an escape when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. The door hissed and slid open with mechanical precision, revealing 2 armed guards in black tactical gear. Their movements were sharp and deliberate, their weapons raised and aimed squarely at me, Elizabeth's body. Hands where we can see them. One of them barked, his voice firm and unyielding. Panic surged through me, Elizabeth's small hands trembling as I raised them slowly. Her chest felt tight, her breathing rapid. The guards weren't just suspicious, they knew. The second guard stepped forward, his weapon steady, his expression cold and calculating. "We know you're in there," he said. "Whoever you are, we're not letting you leave this room." I tried to speak, to say something that might calm them down, but Elizabeth's soft voice cracked as I stammered. I don't know what you're talking about." They didn't believe me. The first guard gestured with his weapon, his tone harsh. "Move! Over to the chair, now!" I hesitated, Elizabeth's legs shaking as I glanced at the heavy chair bolted to the floor near the center of the room. It had thick metal restraints attached to the arms and legs, clearly meant for containment. I'm not. Now!" The guard barked, cutting me off. Swallowing hard, I stepped toward the chair, Elizabeth's small frame trembling as I climbed into it. Before I could think of a way to escape, the second guard moved swiftly, locking heavy shackles around her wrists and ankles. The metal was cold and unyielding, digging into her skin as the restraints clicked into place. Her legs barely reached the edge of the seat, her hands bound tightly to the armrests. I struggled instinctively, pulling against the restraints, but it was no use. I was trapped! The guards exchanged a glance, their weapons still trained on me. One of them pulled out a device, small and rectangular, with a screen that lit up as he pressed a button. "She's definitely possessed," the first guard muttered, staring at the screen. "Readings are off the charts." The second guard nodded, his expression grim. "The question is, by who?" I froze, my mind racing. They know I'm here. Whoever had designed this system, this ghost detection, this lockdown, had done it with the knowledge that something like me could exist. The Yates family wasn't just powerful, they were prepared for the impossible. One of the guards leaned closer, his sharp eyes narrowing as he stared at me. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Why are you in her body?" I stayed silent, my mind scrambling for a way out. "You'd better start talking," the other guard added, his tone dangerous. "We have ways of dealing with ghosts, and trust me, you don't want to find out what they are." Elizabeth's small body felt suffocated, her heart pounding as I tried to think of a response. What the hell is going on here? The door hissed open again, and my stomach, or, rather, Elizabeth's, dropped as Alan Yates stepped into the room. His presence was commanding as always, but this time, there was no charm, no fatherly pretense. His face was cold, his eyes sharp and calculating as he stared at his daughter sitting shackled to the chair like a criminal. Or worse, like a mutant. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there, his gaze locked onto Elizabeth as though she were some kind of science experiment gone wrong. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the hum of the monitors and the faint whir of machinery in the walls. Then, without looking away, Alan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote. It was sleek and simple, with a single red button that he pressed without hesitation. Suddenly, a searing pain ripped through Elizabeth's body, sharp and electric, like every nerve was on fire. I screamed, Elizabeth's high-pitched voice echoing through the room as her small frame writhed against the restraints. The shock lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it stopped, I slumped forward, gasping for breath, Elizabeth's chest heaving as the pain ebbed away. Alan finally spoke, his tone calm but ice cold. "That was level 1, he said, stepping closer to the chair. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he crouched down to meet Elizabeth's wide, tear-filled eyes. "Do you want to find out what level 2 feels like?" I stared at him, stunned. He wasn't just calm, he was collected, as though he'd done this before. As though he'd been waiting for this moment. "I don't know who you are," Alan said, his voice low and deliberate, "but you've made a grave mistake. Possessing my daughter? Coming into my home? You must think you're very clever." I tried to speak, but the pain had left me momentarily speechless, Elizabeth's small voice caught in her throat. Alan tilted his head slightly, his cold gaze boring into me. "So here's how this works," he continued. "You tell me who you are, why you're here, and what you want, or I'll press this button again. And next time, I won't stop at level 1. The guards stood silently nearby, their weapons still trained on me, waiting for Alan's signal. I could feel Elizabeth's body trembling, her heart racing in terror. For a brief moment, guilt flickered through me. I hadn't just put myself in danger, I dragged her into this nightmare, too. But there was no going back now. I forced myself to meet Alan's cold stare, trying to steady Elizabeth's voice as I spoke. "I'm not here to hurt her," I said quickly, the words tumbling out. "I swear." Alan's expression didn't change. "Then why are you here?" I hesitated, my mind racing. I couldn't give him the full truth, not yet. But I had to say something. "I'm looking for answers," I said finally, my voice trembling. "About what happened to me." Alan raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of curiosity flickering across his face. "And what, exactly, happened to you?" I hesitated again, but there was no point in lying. "I was murdered," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And you know something about it?" For the first time, Alan's expression shifted. It was subtle, but I saw it, the faint tightening of his jaw, the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew. "Interesting," he said slowly, standing up and straightening his jacket. He glanced down at the remote in his hand, running his thumb over the red button as though considering his next move. "I don't know who you are," he said again, his tone colder now, "but let me make one thing very clear. Whatever answers you're looking for, you won't find them here. And if you think you can threaten me by possessing my family, you're sorely mistaken." He stepped back, turning to the guards. "Keep her here. Let her think about her mistakes," he said, his voice dismissive. Alan turned to leave, but before he could take a step, I yelled out, Elizabeth's voice cracking with desperation, "I know about Project Sawyer." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Alan froze mid-step. Slowly, he turned back toward me, his cold, calculating expression replaced by something new, something darker. His eyes narrowed, and he took a measured step closer to the chair. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low and dangerously calm. I forced Elizabeth's trembling body to sit up straighter, meeting his icy gaze. "You heard me," I said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I know about Project Sawyer. I know you've been covering it up. And I know it's tied to my murder." Alan's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the remote so tightly I thought he might crush it. For the first time, I saw something crack in his carefully constructed facade.